All right, so this is the solution video to the random user profile generator. So we'll go into the CodePen, the starter code, and the first thing we'll do, like I always like to do, is just get the button click event set up. So I select it using query selector and the ID btn, and then I save it to variable, add event listener, and I like to just check that it works with an alert, and it looks good. So next, we can move on to making the fetch. So I'm going to make a variable, just call it URL, and just set it equal to the API URL that we've been working with. Just make sure it's valid. Perfect. So we're going to do a fetch URL, and we'll add our .then and .catch in there, and we'll just do some really basic. Let's do a function res, and we'll just print out res. And we'll do the same thing, except we'll call it error, or error. Just like that. Cool. So let's make sure that works. Click our button. Let's open the console, clear some of this out. Okay. Looking good. We're getting our response object. So the next thing to do is to parse our JSON. So we'll just add in a .then before that also has a response, and we're just going to return res.json. Pass that into here, and let's rename this from res to data. Doesn't actually matter, but this makes more sense because by the time we hit this, this will be the JSON data coming back from here. Up here, it's a response object. We can print both if we wanted to. Console.log res first, then we parse it. So I'll do console.log parsing, and then when it finishes, down here, we'll print the data. Okay, let's try that out. Click the button. Looks good. So it prints out the response object, then we get parsing, and then we get our data down here. So we have a couple of directions we can go with this. The first thing that I would do is identify what pieces of data we want out. And let's start with the most obvious thing on the page, this full name right here. Div ID equals full name, Jon Snow. How do we get the full name out of this? If we look, okay, results is the key we need to work with. So that's the first thing we care about. And I like to just whittle it down. So we have our data dot results. That gives us an array. As you can see here, it only has one item. So we need to do data dot results bracket 0. And then to get into name, it's under name here, but there's no full name. So it's first and last we need to combine together. So let's try that. We'll just let's make a variable here. We'll just call it full name equals, and we want data dot response, or excuse me, results bracket 0, because this is an array. It only has one thing in here. I believe this API allows you to specify that you want 10 or 5 or however many random users, so it returns an array. But by default, it's just one item, which is what we want. So data.results 0, and let's just start there and print out full name, even though it's not actually full name. We do that. There we go. We're getting a single user. So then we want .name, as we saw here, and let's do .first. I know there's a lot going on the screen. Let me minimize some of this here. Okay. There we go. We get Nathan, or Storm. Oh, I like that name. And Byron. So that's looking good. So we'll start with that. And now let's focus on updating the DOM, because the process for the rest of the other properties is pretty much the same. And what we want to do is select the div right here with ID full name and replace this inner text. So let's select that, and we can do it up top for now. So var, and the hardest part for me here is coming up with good names for this. Let's just call it full name display equals document dot query selector. We have an ID full name, and save. Then we'll come down here and set full name disp dot inner text equals, and let's just do the first name to start. Well, I'll just use the variable I've already created. How about that? So even though it's only the first name for now. So let's see what happens. Clear some of this out. Next user. And scroll up here and we get Nicholas, or Nicola, however you say it. So to get the full name there, we want to do plus, we want a space plus data.results 0 dot name dot last. And now if we try it, there we go. We're getting that full name updating there. So we can refactor this. There's some repetition here, this data.results 0, data.results 0. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, but let's now focus on the image. So to get this image, we're going to need to use inside of here, if we look at our data, if we print our full data again, console.log data, inside of the results 0, what we want to pull out of here is under picture, and I used medium. So let's start off by selecting the actual avatar image, which is right here. So we'll do that up here, var avatar equals document dot query selector with our ID avatar, and that needs to be the ID Octothorpe. Then down here, make some more space. This is an obnoxiously long line that we will be refactoring in a bit. But down here, the next thing we can do is you do avatar.src equals data.results 0.picture.medium. And let's see if it works. There we go. So we're updating the name and the picture. Okay, so let's do a bit of refactoring. This is getting kind of annoying right here. So to refactor this, what I'm actually going to do is first pull this parsing. We can get rid of the console.logs, but pull the parsing code, the res.json, into its own function. So I'll start by doing that, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So down here, I'm going to create a function, and I'll just call it, let's do parse JSON, just like that. And there's a couple reasons I want to do this. One is that I just like having the ability just to say parse JSON here, clean it up, like I showed you here as a potential way of organizing our code. But more importantly, what I'm going to do is do return res.json with a dot then here. And what I'm going to return out of here is data.results 0. So what this will do is, rather than just having to reference data.results 0 everywhere in here, I can actually just replace it with data. Because what's happening is I'm returning, so once the JSON is parsed and we get all of that, it's in a variable called data, and I'm returning data.results 0. So up here, it's passed in, and when we refer to data now, as you can see, if I refresh the page or open up the console, when I click, we just have the actual person data. We no longer have, results in an array and accessing the first item. We don't have to do that. So we've narrowed it down and basically passed in the data we care about so that we can clean up our code here. So now we only have to say data.name. And I do think it might be kind of confusing to have this data here and call this data. So I might change that just for clarity's sake, mainly just for educational purposes. So I'm going to change this. Instead of data, I'm going to call this parsed data, just to make it clear that they're different. But everything should still work the same as you see here. Okay, so now we have this parsed JSON. The next thing that we could do is extract all of this to its own function, so that I could do something like, instead of just saying parse JSON, I could do .then, and I could call this, update profile. And that would be the code that actually manipulates the DOM. So I'll do that now. Function update profile. And rather than calling this data, I kind of like calling it, and that's all we need to do, and it should still work just fine. So we're parsing the JSON, then we're updating the profile. Everything still works. And so now we have our named functions. It's clear. First this happens, then that happens. And we can come in and do the same thing so that we're updating not only the full name and the profile picture, but also the username. So I'll do that next. Okay, so I started off by selecting the div that has the ID of username. Right now it has King of the North in there. And I used query selector like I did for everything else. And then down here, I'm setting the inner text to be equal to data.login.username, which is inside the response data. It's under login username. And while we're here, let's take a look at where city is. It's inside location.city. So before I do city, let's just make sure it works. There we go. So we're now getting the username to change as well. Perfect. Okay, so lastly, city. Okay, so selected it up here. City equals document.querySelector city with the ID, and then set the inner text to data.location.city. Make sure it works. And there we go. The city is changing. So we have all the data updating. Oh, actually we're missing one thing, the email. So same process. So email is just its own field here in the top level. So that makes it easy. So I'm just going to set email.innerText equals data.email. This email here is referring to up here where I selected the email. All right, so let's take a look. Everything's updating how it should. Perfect. So the last thing that we could do if we wanted to handle errors, which we're not doing right now, I would start off with a .then handle errors, and that would be the first thing I do. So I need to define that function handle errors, and that takes a response. And this is where we do our logic. If res is not okay, we can throw an error, and in here we'll just do the res.status. We've seen that before. And we still need to return response so that we're passing it in to parse JSON. So we're handling the errors like we've done before. If we're requesting a bad URL, 404, or some other status code that's not 200, throw an error. Otherwise, return the response. And from here, goes into parse JSON. Then we update the profile. And then we also have this catch, which we could extract into a separate thing as well. Maybe we'll call this display errors. And then down here, we can just define, let me just paste it in actually. Function display errors. Very simple. And we're just console.logging the error. Maybe I'll just do a console.log inside display errors, just so you can see where that's coming from. Okay, so that should be good here. We've got first fetch, then handle errors, then parse JSON, then update profile, and then our catch display errors. Let's make sure everything works still. Open the console up. Let's make sure we don't see anything there. Looks good. And if I turn off my internet and try it now, we're getting inside display errors, perfect, and then the error itself is printing. So everything's working how it should. So hopefully you see how cleaning this up a bit, it's just a preference, but it makes the listener code much simpler because we're already nesting inside a callback here. So adding a bunch more nested code with defining functions up here is kind of ugly in my opinion, and it gets out of control. This is very easy to understand what's happening, and then we just have our nice little neat named functions down here. Some people would argue it is less succinct, it is more code, but I think it's worth it. Just an opinion though. So that's it. We're successfully parsing, well, we're making the request, we're handling any errors that have to do with the status code, then we're parsing the response, we're passing that in to the update profile function that is going to do the hard work of changing the DOM, manipulating all these properties, and then finally, if there's a problem, we have our display errors. Perfect. So we're done. That's it. Hopefully you hung in there through that. Moving on now to learn about some other tools that help us make requests.